This is lecture 6, an introduction to politics. I'll look at this in this lecture on the hot button issues in the culture wars. There's the big political ideologies which we've looked at previously: liberalism, conservatism, Marxism, various forms of right-wing thinking, fascism, Nazism, nationalism. These are large mega issues or ideological perspectives when we think ideology in politics. There has emerged within the last few decades, increasingly so, a focus on particular issues which are usually part of the larger ideologies, but they have lives of their own also. So in that sense, we can look at feminism, ecological issues, multiculturalism, the rise of certain types of religious fundamentalism, identity politics, gender politics, abortion, euthanasia, traditional family values, immigration, secularism, refugees, and I could go on and on in terms of looking at these hot button issues in the culture wars. Needless to say, none of these issues, whether it's feminism, First Nations issues, identity politics, social justice warriors, woke, right-wing movements which respond to some of these issues. Within these particular movements themselves, which tend to be more single-issue events, they are not homogeneous groups. So the danger always of thinking in any of these specific issues, whether it's feminism or, for example, First Nations events, do all feminists think the same? Do all First Nations people think the same? Are they homogeneous groups? Well, of course not. Ecological movements, do all within the ecological movement think the same? So there are women on the soft right, there are women in the center, and the women on the left in feminism. Within the First Nations communities, there are those on the right, there are those in the center, and there'd be those on the left. And so when we think of the hot button issues in the culture wars, the first danger when encountering this is to assume that those who hold high a certain position or in the center of protest and advocacy, they represent the group they claim to be representing. Any thoughtful person at a certain point will ask, the interpretation you have on First Nations, feminism, identity politics, gender questions, do you represent all of the community? And of course, if they're honest, they will say, no, this is a particular read of the hot button issue we're engaging. Now, what often happens in the heat of the culture wars, the voice which is often the loudest, either on the streets or in advocacy, or the media picks up on it. Remember, media is constantly preys on melodrama. It loves conflict. It is addicted to portraying conflictual situations in a heated way. And of course, that's what keeps media in business, is constantly telling stories by which people are like rams in rutting season in that sense. And so stories can be told that pit one person against another, one group against another. It makes a good story. Often the moderate middle is left out. The thoughtful, sane, sensible middle is totally ignored in these extremes that go at one another. And so it is one thing to bring to the fore some of these, what we would call significant issues, but they're usually attached to larger ideologies. it's equally important to recognize that there are different interpretations within these ideologies themselves. Hence, when a person is thinking of politics, an introduction to politics, when we think issues per se, to be very wary of not uncritically being drawn into the gravitational field of a particular read of an issue in the culture wars. But often what happens as this occurs, people get drawn into it. They see how others are treated who don't belong to the interpretation. Friendships, relationships begin to dissolve as a result of this. And then basic civility becomes undermined in the culture wars themselves by a simplistic interpretation of an issue, and then the other person becomes the problem and is demonized, or if they are part of a group at any time and they finally break to it through minimally critical thinking, then they're seen as an apostate or a heretic in that sense. So some of these ideological movements, which are just secularized forms of religion, or they become a new religion in themselves, in that religion, religio, in terms of the ligaments, their attempt to hold together the ligaments of society, but they operate in exactly the same way as elements of the worst form of religion has in the past, in that there's the pure remnant, the true ones, the ones who know, the ones who interpret the insights of the divine for humanity. Now the true, as it were, what T.S. Eliot would call the new strange gods that are amongst us these days. They are the orthodox who define how to interpret difficult issues in the culture wars. Those who differ with them are branded as heterodox, heretics, apostate, and it's the same version of the worst form of religion now applied to hot-button issues in the culture wars. And so people are pilloried, they're rhetorically dismissed, they're cancelled in terms of others who disagree with them. And so the very means of dealing with opposition continues an older way of engaging those who don't fit within the orthodox interpretive tribe. So when we come to these issues of First Nations, feminism, gender, religion, abortion, euthanasia, traditional family values, law and order, such as which form of justice is right, transformative justice, rehabilitative, restorative justice. People are going to divide on this. Each will go picking cherries on the tree that they think best articulates ways of interpreting the situation. And usually in most situations, both sides, the political right, they're usually right on certain things, but very blind in many other ways. They have their Achilles heel. The left is often very insightful on significant issues, but they also can have eyes closed and be cyclopean in many other ways. And so the whole issue of ideology in the larger sense, and then ideology as it plays itself out with specific issues in the culture wars, are very, very much with us today. And so in dealing with these difficult issues, a thoughtful person at their best should always be asking themselves, how are facts being used to prove cases that ignore other facts? Simple empirical investigation, historically or in the present tense. What's being concealed in certain conclusions in terms of ideologically being revealed? This will assist people in, when we think introduction to politics, because politics, particularly para-politics or cultural politics, because politics can be understood in a formal sense of parties, voting, representatives, courts, executive, that's politics in the formal sense in which people make decisions as representatives. But there's also cultural politics, which is parapolitical, in which the difficult hot-button issues in the culture wars, the media very, very interested in these because of the conflictual nature, but they operate at the formal political process, but at their most intense in the parapolitical process, and certainly with Twitter, Facebook, and other means of instant communication that we live with today, people can strut their agenda and beat their drums very loudly, and there is no limiting what can be said or done, because it's a bit of a market economy free-for-all when it comes to information and who has it, who articulates it, and those who differ, how they are treated verbally through media. We can see how finally, if you go too far one direction, you get Trump, in which finally Twitter decides that this level of free speech in fact is the misuse of free speech. For within the best types of liberal democracy, freedom and responsibility, liberty and accountability are always meant to be held together. And you'll get the political right will often use the language of free speech as a means of articulating their particular reductionistic agenda, and the left itself very concerned with how free speech, what they argue, is being used to legitimate racism, hate, and the questions the left raises are quite legitimate when free speech is being used in a way that in fact undermines the very meaning of freedom or liberty in a sense. John Stuart Mill legitimately argued no one has the right to yell fire in a crowded theater. And so when we look at the debates around free speech today and how it's both being used ideologically and rhetorically to undermine thoughtful discussions of the content of free speech, we can see how the worst forms of ideology come to dominate in the issues that animate many people today. And so when the right wants to use the language of free speech, you want to say freedom for what? And what's the content of the use of your freedom? And so often when people misuse the freedom in that sense, they lose their freedom. And so when the progressives on the left are concerned with elements of the right's use of speech for questionable content, then in the culture wars they raise legitimate points. On the other hand, on the right, those who feel their speech is undermined by raising legitimate questions on the left slips into what Marcuse would call earlier repressive tolerance. And so the left can take a position dogmatically at times in which it allows no questioning of the progressive agenda whatsoever, and people who dare to question it are called hate-mongering or racist. There's a variety of rhetorical terms tossed the way to the right. Hence the repression of tolerance, and even though the left talks tolerance all the time, there's a point where it very, very much silences critical thinking in terms of its own agenda. So when we think then of ideology and politics as we move from the larger macro ideological perspectives to specific issues, which very much are in the theater of ethical items in our day, we have to be very, very careful that each of these groups, their own house is divided ones. People can isolate themselves in little rooms, flattering themselves that they understand an issue in a way that others don't, and those who differ with them, as I mentioned earlier, are seen as apostate and heretics. And the right and the left at the extremes, so you can go from the right, the soft right, the far right, and the extreme right, and the same on the left, the soft left, the extreme left, and far left. Both groups at their more extremes have a way of silencing one another, and as one moves closer to the center, hopefully in some civil and meaningful way, people learn to listen to one another. For where there is no listening, there's polarization, and we've seen where that leads to. South of us, in which basic civility is banished, people become fragmented, and issues of unity virtually disappear like a cloud in the sky, and then it is very hard to hold to the south of us a republic together, and this will be the challenge of Biden as he moves into a post-Trump era.